My husband was just accused of molesting a girl in the elevator. There's only one problem: he hasn't had hands for 5 years. The day I moved into Riverfront residences, I became public enemy no. 1 in the entire community. It all started with my neighbor, the influencer sexy, innocent Yvonne, who had over 1 million followers on Toktik. Right now she was holding a phone stand right outside my door, crying her eyes out, making people sympathize with her chat. I can't take it anymore. I thought there were only good people in this community, but it turns out there's a right animal living here. Yvonne tugged at her collar, which was already as low as it could go, showing off loads of skin and some pretty, shocking red marks on her neck. She pointed at my tightly shut door, yelling, "The man who lives in this apartment looks like a nice guy, but half an hour ago he molested me in the elevator. He knew there was no signal in the elevator, so he not only verbally harassed me, he also pinned me to the wall. He used his hand to clamp my mouth shut. With the other hand, he tried to rip my dress. If the elevator door hadn't opened just in time, I would have. At this point she seemed overwhelmed with emotion. She squatted down and started bawling. The live stream's viewer count skyrocketed to over 100,000. Comments flooded and filled with outrage outside. Yvonne's mother, Jenny Shaw, turned up to this old lady could act even better than her daughter. He banged on the door and wailed into a megaphone, "Open up, you have the guts to do bad things, but don't have the guts to open the door. Look, everyone. This is the animal living in Unit 2801. He harassed my daughter, who just turned 20. What? A scumbag if you won't come out. I'll kill myself at your door." The noise was giving me a headache. Put down the hot towel I was holding and looked at my husband, Chris Gomez, who was lying on the physiotherapy bed and hooked up to a breathing machine. Though he could not speak, his eyes were full of worry. He seemed to have heard the commotion outside and was trying hard to turn his head, gently patted his shoulder and said softly, "It's all right, just a few barking dogs. I'll handle it." Chris's body trembled. A pang of sorrow hit me. 5 years ago, in that mall fire that shocked the whole country, he went in and out of the mall 3 times as the fire brigade captain. The last time to save a trapped little girl. He was hit by a falling beam. It not only ruined his face, but also took both his arms. The past 5 years we've been living a peaceful and comfortable life, with the compensation money and the money I made from earlier investments to provide him with a better rehabilitation environment. I specifically moved to this large apartment with a river view. Who would have thought that on the very first day we moved in, we would be framed like this? Molest pinned against the wall. Hands all over. I smirked, my eyes turning cold. If they want to make a scene, then they better be ready for the consequences. Went to the entrance and swung the door open violently. The crying and shouting outside came to an abrupt halt. Yvonne did not expect me to open the door. She froze for a second, then shoved the camera in my face. "Cat, look. This is the pervert's wife. She finally shows herself." Jenny lunged at me like a mad dog, pointing at my face and shouting, "You shameless wench, get your pervert husband out here. He touched my daughter. We won't let you off until you pay us $1 million for emotional trauma." Yvonne sobbing added, "Girl, you're a woman too. How can you protect your husband after what he did to me? Look at the marks on my neck. They're left by his fingers when he choked me." She stretched out her neck too. Give the camera a close-up shot. The red swollen finger marks were clearly visible. Look closely, this is evidence. This is undeniable proof of his wrongdoing. The neighbors pointed and stared, their eyes full of disgust, seeing the girl's greedy and scheming face. I did not panic. Instead, I could not help but laugh. Evidence, finger marks. I crossed my arms and looked down at the pair of clowns. "Your name is Yvonne, right? You're saying my husband choked you and ripped your clothes with his hands?" Yvonne straightened up and said with unwavering confidence, "That's right." His hands were shockingly strong and covered in calluses. They hurt so much I'll never forget those hands. Good, I nodded, a glint of coldness in my eyes. "Hopefully when we get to court, you'll still remember what those hands look like. Because my husband lost his hands in a fire 5 years ago. You said he choked you with what?" "His imaginary hands." Hearing my mockery, Yvonne's expression froze, but only for a moment. Next second, she acted like she had heard the funniest joke ever and shouted even louder into the camera, "Guys, listen to this." As expected of a pervert's family member to defend the rapist, she's cursing her own husband to not have hands. "Are you saying I was fighting with a ghost in the elevator?" Jenny spat on the ground, making up lies to dodge responsibilities. "I saw him downstairs with my own eyes. Your husband was wearing black. He had his hands in his pockets when he entered the elevator. How can he not have hands?" I laughed. Instead of getting angry, leaning against the door to watch their performance. Oh, you saw him with his hands in his pockets, of course. Jenny said confidently both hands were in his pockets. Quit acting like he's disabled. Yvonne helped by crying to the police. That's right, the local police had arrived. Officer, don't listen to that woman's lies. That man was so strong back in the elevator. She gestured wildly, sobbing as she described the details. His palms were so rough. His fingers were full of calluses. It hurt so much when the calluses scratched my thighs. And his left hand was especially strong. When it grabbed the back of my neck, I felt like my bones were going to break. I fought back desperately and managed to scratch the back of his hand. There must be my fingernail marks on the back of his right hand. That's the proof. The police officer frowned as he took notes. When he looked at me, his gaze was laced with, "Ma'am, please ask your husband, Chris Gomez, to come out and assist with the investigation. We can find out the truth by just inspecting the injury." I stood in the doorway, not budging. "Officer, my husband's physical condition is a little unusual. He's undergoing sterile treatment, so he can't be exposed to the outside air or be stimulated. Right now you can investigate, but I request a lawyer to be present." Coldly swept my eyes over Yvonne and her mother. "I want the entire questioning process to be recorded with a body cam." "You're guilty, you're feeling guilty," Yvonne screamed while pointing at me. "You're afraid. The officer will see the scratches on the back of his hand." Aren't you looking at Yvonne's face that was twisted with excitement? The last bit of sympathy I had disappeared. If I just let them go inside to have a look, this farce would be over, but they were too greedy, too eager to solidify the molestation charge, and too desperate for the so-called emotional trauma compensation. Since they were so confident, even making up details like calluses on the hands, left hand, grabbing the neck and scratches on the back of the hand, then I would help them turn to the officer and said, "Okay, I'll cooperate with the investigation. But like I said, my husband can't move right now. I'll go to the police station with you to make a statement. As for the injury verification," I smirked mysteriously, "you can examine him as much as you want in court." Yvonne replied almost immediately, "You in court don't come crying to me." Then on the day of the trial, the area outside the court was filled with reporters and fans who were holding up signs supporting Yvonne. Yvonne, wearing a plain white dress, walked into the courtroom supported by her lawyer and her mother. When she saw me sitting alone in the defendant's family seat, a flicker of smug mockery crossed her eyes. Trial began. Yvonne's lawyer was the first to strike his words sharp. "Your Honor, the defendant, Chris Gomez, took advantage of the enclosed space in the elevator to forcibly commit sexual assault against my client. His actions were despicable, causing serious physical and mental harm to my client." Then Yvonne took the stand as a witness. She described once again in even greater detail than before the non-existent crime that day. "I entered the elevator and the defendant followed me in. Because there were only two of us in the elevator. I was very scared. He suddenly hugged me from behind. His hands were very strong. They felt like iron clamps." Yvonne closed her eyes as if recalling something terrifying. Her body trembled uncontrollably. There was something hard on his left hand's index finger. It felt like a ring. It hurt my neck so much. His right hand tore up my collar. The rough sensation moved around my collarbone. I could even feel the sting from the dirt in his fingernails. Scratching my skin, gasps erupted throughout the courtroom. The crowd was outraged. Many people pointed at me and faint curses were audible. "I'm disgusted if she can remember in such detail. It must be true. Where is Chris Gomez? Is he too ashamed to show his face?" Yvonne wiped away her tears and looked at the judge. "Your Honor, I beg you to severely punish the culprit. He even threatened me," he said, "if I dared to call the police. He would strangle me to death." The judge frowned and turned to the defendant's table. "Why is the defendant not present?" Slowly stood up, straightened my clothes, and looked expressionlessly at Yvonne. At that moment, the air in the courtroom seemed to freeze. "Your Honor, it's not that my husband is unwilling to attend. Because of his physical condition, he has difficulties moving around." Yvonne's lawyer scoffed. "Difficulties moving around or on the run to avoid punishment. He can attend even if he's in a wheelchair, right?" I ignored his mockery. My eyes were locked on Yvonne and my voice was clear and firm. "Miss Shaw, you testified under oath earlier that you could clearly feel the ring on the defendant's left hand, the rough fingertips of his right hand, and even the dirt in his fingernails, correct?" Yvonne was slightly unnerved by my gaze, but still said stubbornly, "Yes. I'll remember those hands until the day I die. Good." I nodded and turned to face the courtroom door. I suddenly raised my voice, trembled a little, but was still very loud. "Since Miss Shaw remembers so clearly, Let's all open our eyes and take a good, hard look at the hand she claimed choked her. Open the door, bring in the defendant. Chris Gomez, as a loud, creaking sound filled the courtroom. The massive wooden doors slowly opened to both sides. All the cameras, all the eyes, all the angry, contemptuous, curious focused on the door. Against the light, a custom-made electric wheelchair slowly rolled in. A man was sitting in the wheelchair. His empty sleeves swayed gently, blown by the cold air from the air conditioning. The hum of the electric wheelchair was barely audible, yet in the dead silence of the courtroom, it sounded like a roaring engine. Chris maneuvered the chair forward using the specialized chin joystick I had custom ordered for him. He was wearing a crisp, dark suit jacket. Because he had no shoulders left to properly hold the garment up, the fabric was tailored to drape flat against his sides. His sleeves hung utterly, devastatingly empty. They were neatly folded and pinned flat against the fabric of his ribs. A thin, transparent tube looped over his ears, delivering a steady stream of oxygen from the portable tank strapped to the back of his chair, helping him breathe through the severe tracheal scarring he sustained 5 years ago. He stopped right beside the defendant's table. He couldn't turn his head fully, but he managed to angle his upper body toward the witness stand. The heavy, angry burn scars that traced up his neck and consumed the left side of his face were fully visible beneath the harsh fluorescent lights of the courtroom. The silence stretched. It was thick, suffocating, and absolute. I turned my gaze to Yvonne. The smug, victorious sneer had completely vanished from her heavily contoured face. Her jaw hung slack. The color drained from her cheeks so fast she looked like she might vomit. Her eyes darted from Chris's scarred face down to the pinned, empty sleeves, and then to me. Your Honor, I broke the silence, my voice ringing out cold and steady. I would like to present my husband, Christopher Gomez. The man Miss Shaw claims choked her with iron-strong hands, scratched her with dirty fingernails, and ripped her clothes. A sudden, sharp gasp rippled through the gallery. The reporters, previously buzzing with righteous indignation on behalf of the influencer, were now staring with wide, horrified eyes. The camera shutters began to click, slow at first, then erupting into a frantic strobe of flashes. Yvonne's lawyer looked like he had been struck by lightning. He looked at his notes, then at Chris, then at Yvonne. He took a step away from his own client, his face flushed with a mixture of shock and sheer professional terror. Objection? He stammered, the words sounding more like a question. He had nothing. On what grounds, counselor? The judge snapped, his eyes fixed on Chris with a look of profound realization. The judge, an older man with silver hair, seemed to instantly recognize the nature of Chris's injuries. He looked down at the medical file I had just submitted to the clerk. Are these the records from St. Jude's Burn Center? Yes, Your Honor, I replied, stepping out from behind the desk to stand beside my husband. I gently rested a hand on Chris's shoulder. He looked up at me, his eyes gentle, trusting. Bilateral amputation above the elbow. Extensive third-degree burns. Severe respiratory trauma. All sustained 5 years ago. He has not had a prosthetic fitted that possesses articulating fingers, nor has he worn a ring in half a decade. I turned slowly to face the witness box. Yvonne was trembling, but not from the fake trauma she had acted out earlier. This was raw, unadulterated panic. Miss Shaw, I said, stepping closer. Could you point out for the court exactly which hand left the calluses on your collarbone? Was it the left sleeve or the right sleeve? I. Yvonne stammered, her voice a reedy, pathetic squeak. She looked frantically at her mother in the gallery. Jenny Shaw was frozen, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. Or perhaps, I continued, my voice rising, vibrating with the anger I had suppressed for weeks. You meant he threatened to strangle you to death? A man who cannot lift a glass of water to his own lips? A man who needs a machine to help him breathe when he sleeps? He had a coat on. Jenny suddenly shrieked from the gallery, desperate to save the sinking ship. I saw him. His hands were in his pockets. The judge slammed his gavel down so hard the crack echoed like a gunshot. Silence in the gallery. One more outburst, and I will have you detained. He glared at Jenny, then turned his furious gaze upon Yvonne. Miss Shaw, you are under oath. You testified to the feeling of fingernails. You testified to a ring on a left index finger. Explain yourself. Now, Yvonne burst into tears, but this time, the gallery wasn't buying it. The muttering began, dark and aggressive. The very crowd she had summoned to destroy my husband was turning on her in real time. It was dark in the elevator. Yvonne sobbed, gripping the edge of the witness stand. I was terrified. Someone grabbed me, I swear. I must have. I must have just assumed it was him because he was the only one there. My trauma made me imagine the details. Liar, I said quietly, but the microphone picked it up. I walked back to my table and pulled out a thumb drive. Your Honor, may I submit Defense Exhibit B? Proceed. The bailiff took the drive and plugged it into the court's projection system. A moment later, the large screen on the wall flickered to life. It was CCTV footage from our building's lobby. The timestamp showed the exact date and time of the alleged incident. It showed my husband, Chris, rolling his wheelchair into the lobby. Because the AC in the building was notoriously cold, I had draped a large, structured black wool coat over his shoulders to keep him warm. From behind, as the coat fell straight down, it created an illusion. He rolled into the elevator. The doors closed. Fast forward 2 minutes, I instructed. The screen jumped to the footage from the 8th floor. The elevator doors opened. Chris rolled out. The coat was still perfectly draped over his shoulders. He hadn't moved an inch. But what mattered was what happened next. 3 minutes after Chris entered his apartment, the elevator doors on the 8th floor opened again. Out stepped Yvonne. And she wasn't alone. She was accompanied by a tall, heavily tattooed man wearing a baseball cap. They were laughing. The man had his arm wrapped tightly around her neck in a rough, playful chokehold. On his left index finger, a large, silver skull ring caught the light of the hallway. The entire courtroom inhaled sharply. The man kissed her roughly against the wall, his hands roaming her collar, pulling at her dress. Yvonne giggled, slapping his chest. Then, the man looked down the hall, noticed the CCTV camera, and quickly pulled his cap down. He jogged back to the stairwell, leaving Yvonne in the hallway. Yvonne stood there for a moment, adjusting her torn dress. She took out her phone, looked at her reflection, and traced the red marks the man had just left on her neck. Then, she looked directly at our door, Unit 2801. A chilling, calculating smile spread across her face. She messed up her hair, tore her collar a little more, and began to forcefully rub her own neck to make the redness worse. Then, she walked over to our door, hit the record button on her phone, and began to cry. The video ended. The silence was gone now, replaced by a deafening uproar. Reporters were shouting. People in the gallery were cursing. Jenny Shaw tried to sneak out of the courtroom doors, but was blocked by a wall of angry spectators. Yvonne collapsed in the witness stand, burying her face in her hands, her sobs echoing through the microphone. Miss Shaw. The judge's voice was dangerously low, cutting through the noise. The bailiffs moved in to restore order. You have just committed perjury in my courtroom. You have attempted to destroy the life of a disabled man for what? Clout. Money. Yvonne's lawyer hurriedly packed his briefcase. Your Honor, I formally request to withdraw as counsel for the plaintiff. I was blatantly misled by my client and presented fabricated evidence under false pretenses. Request granted. The judge said, not even looking at the lawyer. He locked eyes with Yvonne. Bailiff, take Miss Shaw into custody. I am holding her in contempt of court, and I am recommending the district attorney's office file immediate charges for felony perjury, filing a false police report, and extortion. 2 bailiffs approached the witness stand. Yvonne screamed, thrashing as they grabbed her arms. No, no, please. My career. My followers. You can't do this. I'm a victim. I just wanted the money. They have so much money. It was just a joke. A joke. I repeated, the word tasting like ash in my mouth. I stepped forward, blocking her path as the bailiffs led her down. I didn't yell. I didn't have to. My husband lost his arms, his face, and his lungs pulling a 6-year-old girl out of a burning shopping mall while the roof collapsed on him. He is a decorated fire captain who gave up everything so a child could live. And you tried to brand him a rapist for a few TikTok likes. Yvonne froze, her eyes widening in absolute horror as the reality of who she had targeted finally settled in. He's the fire captain. A reporter in the front row whispered loudly. Suddenly, the gallery erupted again. 5 years ago, Chris's story had been national news. The identity of the anonymous, disfigured hero had been fiercely protected by me and his former squad to allow him to heal in peace. Now, the truth was out, but it was out as a shield. Take her away, the judge ordered, disgusted. As Yvonne was dragged out of the courtroom, wailing for her mother, I walked back to Chris. The trial was formally dismissed. The gavel banged one final time, but I hardly heard it. I knelt beside his wheelchair, ignoring the cameras, the shouting reporters, and the chaos around us. I looked into his eyes. They were wet with tears, but not from sadness. The heavy burden of the last few weeks, the stares of our neighbors, the vile comments online, the fear of being misunderstood, was gone. "It's over, my love," I whispered, reaching up to gently wipe a tear from his unscarred cheek. "I told you I'd handle the barking dogs." Chris leaned his head into my hand, pressing his cheek against my palm. He let out a long, shaky breath, closing his eyes. A small, crooked smile touched his lips. 2 months later, the fallout was catastrophic for Yvonne, and I watched it happen from the comfort of our riverfront balcony with a cup of coffee in hand. The internet is a vicious beast, and when it turns, it devours. The moment the courtroom footage leaked, along with the CCTV footage of her orchestrating the entire lie, Yvonne's million followers evaporated. Brands dropped her within hours. She was sued for breach of contract by 3 major sponsors. The criminal trial was swift. Yvonne and her boyfriend, who had been easily tracked down by the police, he was a low-level grifter with a gambling problem, turned on each other instantly. He claimed it was all her idea to extort the rich, disabled guy. She claimed he forced her to do it to pay off his debts. Ultimately, the judge didn't care who thought of it first. Yvonne was sentenced to 3 years in a state penitentiary for extortion and perjury. Her mother, Jenny, who had been aggressively harassing us and amplifying the lies, was hit with a crushing civil defamation suit from my legal team. She was forced to sell her apartment to pay the damages. The day she moved out of Riverfront Residences, she didn't look at a single person. She just kept her head down, carrying a single cardboard box. Conversely, the public revelation of Chris's identity sparked a massive outpouring of love. Letters, flowers, and donations flooded into our building. We forwarded all the money to the St. Jude's Burn Center, but we kept the letters. I was reading one of those letters to Chris now. The afternoon sun was warm on the balcony, casting a golden hue over the river. Chris was resting on his specialized lounger, looking out at the water. "Dear Captain Gomez," I read aloud, smiling. "I don't know if you remember me. My name is Lily. You pulled me out of the fire 5 years ago. I am 11 years old now. I just made the honor roll at school, and I am learning to play the piano. I wanted you to know that I think of you every time I blow out my birthday candles. You are my hero, and I am so glad the bad lady didn't hurt you." I stopped, my throat tightening. I looked over at Chris. He was staring at the river, but his chest was heaving slightly. "She included a picture," I said softly, holding up a Polaroid of a smiling little girl sitting at a piano. Chris turned his head toward me. He couldn't wipe his own tears, so I did it for him, leaning down to kiss his forehead. "We have an appointment tomorrow," I whispered against his skin. "The specialist from the Robotics Institute called. The new bionic prosthetics are ready for a fitting. They said because of your nerve endings, you might actually be able to feel pressure again, to hold things." Chris's eyes widened. He looked down at his empty sleeves, then back up at me. There was a spark in his eyes that hadn't been there in 5 years. It was hope. "No more hiding," I told him, taking his face in my hands. "You saved a life, Chris. You earned the right to live yours." He couldn't wrap his arms around me, but as he leaned forward and rested his forehead against mine, his steady, rhythmic breathing filling the quiet space between us, I felt held. For the first time since we moved into this building, there was no noise, no malice, no shouting. Just the gentle flow of the river and the quiet, unbreakable strength of the man I loved.